It occurs to me when I think about my crazy family, and I think about particularly my two crazy brothers, who are so extreme that even my mother's own craziness doesn't seem enough to explain the amount of craziness visible in my two brothers. But I think I've thought about it, and I've come to a conclusion. I think what it is, obviously, neither one of them take after only one of my parents. They both have elements of both parents, and that's where the chemical reaction comes in. That's where it becomes a compound chemical. And whereas the first original chemical, that being the personality of my parents, each one is separate, and they may be dangerous but not lethal. But when it becomes a compound chemical, then it's not a pure one or the other, and there's this chemical reaction going on by the intermixing of these two things that individually may be dangerous but not lethal, but then it becomes a lethal combination. And that's why my one brother seems to me that when I look at where does he get his personality, his mentality, it seems to me that he's essentially my mother. His character is essentially my mother, but exaggerated by the addition of certain elements of my father to become basically a more lethal version of my mother, because it's not just my mother, it's some other elements of my father which by themselves would perhaps even be hardly noticeable, but when added to, mixed in with all these crazy elements from my mother, becomes a lethal formula. And my other brother seems to me to be the reverse. My other brother seems to be essentially my father, like some of the worst elements of my father, exaggerated by the addition of other elements of my mother. So my other brother becomes a lethal version of my father. And so the first one, I've always, it's always been quite clear that the first one I was talking about is essentially sadistic, and the other one is masochistic. And these two, they form like reverse images of each other, or like a reverse jacket. One's the outside, one's the inside of the other. Masochist and sadist and masochist. So the sadistic brother seems to me to be my mother, exaggerated by elements from my father. And the masochistic brother seems to me to be essentially the worst elements of my father, exaggerated by additional elements of my mother. And that's what created a masochist. So there you go. That's the conclusion I reach. And then there's my third brother, the only one that can even deal with, who tries to be a decent person, but God, he can be fucking annoying, just emotionally draining. It's not that he's not a nice person or an intelligent person, but he's got aspects of my parents' personalities, of both my parents' personalities too. And where each of my parents could get to be really irritating due to their own personal mannerisms and attitude, just ingrained attitude. And it could be really frustrating. At least they were different. My mother had her own ways of being this irritating, frustrating, annoying, and my father had his own, but they were not the same as my mother's. They were different. But my other third brother being that he's the child of both of them, has elements of both. And there are elements to his personality that can just be irritating and annoying and frustrating, and it is a degree to which it's kind of a little exaggerated or enhanced by the fact that it combines elements of both my parents. It takes the annoying, irritating elements of my mother and my father and mixes them, combines them in together in a way that just becomes really frustrating. Like, you can't even just step aside. Like with my mother, you could step aside and say, well, okay, she's doing that, but at least she's not doing what my father does. And with my father, I could say, okay, he's doing that, but step aside. At least, thank goodness, he's not being like my mother. But with my brother, you can't step aside from it, because you can't. It's like a puddle you can't step out of, because it's either way you're stepping still into more puddle. He's got elements of my mother's annoyance mixed in with elements of my father's annoyance. You just can't. It just drives you up a wall. So there you go.